This is a full stack app where developers or UI UX designers can add different projects and the colors they are using for that project. At the header, this is the project logo, and whatever email address you are using to log in, you can see that email address here. If I click here, you can log out from the application. This is the login page, and if you want to create an account, you can click here and enter your email, password, confirm password. You can create an account. I have already created an account, so let me log in with that. So you can see we have the proper authentication in place as well. So let me show you how to create this entire application in 5 simple steps. In the first step, we'll understand the whole stack and the front-end components for our app. In the second step, we'll set up the complete backend using a very powerful tool from AWS. In the third step, we'll be adding authentication for our application. Next, we'll be adding a simple GraphQL API to talk to our backend, and we will write all the necessary code to perform the CRUD operations. And finally, we will host our application for public access. In the first step, let's discuss our project structure and the front-end part for our application. For the front-end, we are using React, and the complete backend is hosted on AWS. So let's start with the front-end part. In the front-end, we are just using some simple React components. I really don't want to bore you by showing you line-by-line code for that, but let me just give you a simple overview of the complete front-end. Alright, so this is our starting point. This is a very simple Vite React application, right? You can visit the Vite documentation to set up a React application using Vite, right? And I'm using JavaScript for this example. If you want, you can go with JavaScript. And I have configured a couple of things. The first one is Tailwind. I'm using Tailwind for all the CSS styling and everything. And maybe you are already familiar with ShardCN. I am using this ShardCN as well for all the components and everything. So the local host is currently up and running. You already know the main.jsx file. We are having a simple React application. This is the index.css, and this is the Tailwind directives. And ShardCN added all these CSS variables. And in the app.jsx, we are having some top level components. The first one is the header. This is the header component. And then we are having our body. And inside the body, we are having a couple of project cards. And for now, we can see there's an API directory. And we are just mocking some data. So there's some simple function, say list projects, add project, update project. And we are manually providing some data. We'll be initializing all of our backend with AWS. And we will be replacing these function with the real API. Okay, and in the app.jsx, you can see we are iterating over the projects, and to add projects, we are using a couple of popover. You can already see that. So this is the popover form. So we are just collecting the project name, project description, color hex, and we're just appending that. In the second step, we'll be initializing our backend. Now, to manage the complete backend, we'll be using a tool called AWS Amplify. So before going into the initialization part, let me give you a basic overview of AWS Amplify. So AWS Amplify is an open source project from AWS, right? So this is basically an abstraction over all the complexity that AWS has, right? So this AWS Amplify has mainly 3 components. The first one is AWS Amplify CLI. Okay, so this is the command line interface tool. And this is the main component, you can say. And the second part is Amplify core library, and third is Amplify UI library. So let's take an example and let's understand all these 3 components. So let's say you want to have an REST API or a GraphQL API maybe. So you have installed Amplify in your system. So when you are installing Amplify on your system, you're basically installing this Amplify CLI. And to add an API, you are running this command, Amplify add API. In your project, it will basically create some files, create some configuration files. So this configuration file will describe your API, like how many endpoints do you want, what will happen when someone is calling that endpoint. Okay, those kind of things will be described in this configuration file. Now, in the next step, you are running Amplify push. So by running Amplify push, you are basically creating all the services in the cloud. So this is our complete backend. By running Amplify add API and answering some question, we are creating some configuration file in our local system that will describe the actual backend services. And by running Amplify push, we are creating those services. So let's say it is creating an API gateway, a lambda function, and a DynamoDB database. Now, these are the configuration file you have created with Amplify add API. And let's say in your project there are some front-end files as well. So if you are using a React application, there will be some files related to React. So from those files, if you want to talk to these services, then you have to use this Amplify core UI library, this one, right? Core library. So what is happening? This is our backend. We have first initialized the backend, then we have created all the resources. And now from our front-end application, we are communicating with that backend resources with the help of this Amplify core library. And this is some, it's like if you are using Node.js, then these are some JavaScript files maybe. And the Amplify UI libraries, there are some pre-built UI component that you can use. Let's say when you are using the authentication component, there will be some pre-built login and sign up form that you can import from Amplify UI library. These are also some simple JavaScript files maybe. So if you are using React, then you have to install React specific UI library. If you're using Vue, then you will be installing Vue specific library. But this Amplify core library will be same across all the frameworks. And if you are using native JavaScript, then also you have to use this core library. Okay, so this is the main concept. With the CLI, you are generating this configuration file and creating the backend resources. And with the help of this Amplify core library from your front-end project, you are talking to those backend resources. And if you need any pre-built UI component, then you are using this Amplify UI library. So this is the simple concept of AWS Amplify, and I will put the documentation link in the description as well. Now, to use Amplify, you need to globally install it in your system and have to configure it as well. To do that, you can go through the documentation, or we have a complete playlist to set up AWS and all the necessary tools from scratch. You can follow that as well. So I'm assuming you already installed Amplify in your system. And let's start with the initialization part. Alright, so I have opened my VS Code terminal at the root of my project. Now you just have to type Amplify in it at the top of your project. So this will basically initialize an Amplify project. So it is asking you for the project name. Now project asset is fine. And it is picking some default from your project structure. So name and the environment is dev by default. Default editor, it is picking up VS Code. App type JavaScript. Framework, it is detecting React. Source directory src. And distribution directory is like after the build, what would be the directory. But for create React app, the output directory is build, but for Vite, it is dist, I guess. So we are not happy with these settings. We have to manually enter that. So I am choosing N here. And for our case, we are not going with multiple environments. So prod is fine. VS Code, JavaScript, React, source directory src is fine. Now this will be dist. Okay, build command, that is fine. Start command is also fine. So whenever you are initializing any Amplify project, you have to go through these steps. So this will basically initialize couple of resources in the backend, or some authentication role and some deployment bucket and those things. And that is kind of abstracted away from you. You don't have to understand S3. You don't have to understand IAM to work with this. Okay, Amplify will tackle that. Now it is asking you to share some non-sensitive like error information if there is any failure in the CLI. So if you want, you can share that. I'm just choosing no. All right, so we have successfully initialized an Amplify project. So we have already discussed, right? Amplify will create some configuration file. So this is like all the configuration file will be stored in this directory. So in the backend right now, we're not having anything, but once we add different services, there will be different files here. All right. And you don't have to worry about this configuration now. Whatever it has created, that's fine. So in the third step, we'll be adding authentication to our application, and we'll be using some pre-built UI components to handle the sign up and sign in form. So just type Amplify add auth. It will again ask you some questions. Whatever default configuration is, we are okay with that. We want the users to sign in with their email. Yeah, and rest of the things are fine for us. So now if I open the previous diagrams, this part, so we have added a new service. So this part is completed, right? Now in our local system, it has created some configuration file. You can see in the back end, now there is a auth directory, and in the auth directory, there is some configuration. You don't have to worry about this. Okay, for now, it won't make any sense. But yeah, so these are the configuration file it has created. Now we have to push this configuration to the backend, AWS backend, so that those resources can be created. All right, to do that, you just have to run Amplify push. Okay, it will pick up all the changes in your system, like whatever services you added, and if you update anything, that will be picked up as well. So you can see in the current environment, you have this create operation with this auth. Okay, do you want to continue? Yes. So it will take a couple of minutes maybe, depending upon your internet speed and some other factors. All right, so it has successfully deployed our authentication resources. So in the next step, we have to install these two packages in our project, right, to talk to the services from our front end application. So this is the amplified documentation. I will put the link in the description, but make sure you are selecting generation 1. Okay, there is a second thing, generation 2, but we are not interested in that, and you are choosing version 6. All right, they keep updating this stuff, but yeah, for now generation on version 6 is fine. And if you click on this getting started, it will show you how to install the things. Now this is how you install the CLI, but that is already done, I'm assuming. And now we have to set up these two libraries, these two things. So Amplify core library to talk to those services, and we do not want to set up the login and sign up form from ourselves, so we'll be using Amplify UI library for that as well. So for that reason, so this is the core library, by the way, AWS Amplify. So let me install that first. So I'm using pnpm, that library, AWS Amplify. And for the UI library, you can click on this UI library part, and yeah, this is the UI library. So AWS Amplify, we have already installed that. Let me copy this. If you are using Angular or Vue, you have to install the UI library according to that. So yeah, let me copy that, go back to our project, pnpm add Amplify UI React. All right, once that is getting installed, the first thing we have to do is, in our front end project, we have to configure that Amplify core library with whatever configuration it is generating, right? So if I see here, you can see like in the source directory, it has created a couple of files: Amplify configuration, Amplify exports. Okay, so based on these files, we have to configure our Amplify core library. So let me show you how to do that. You can follow the documentation as well if you want. So in your main.jsx, you have to import Amplify from AWS Amplify, and there's a method called configure. So you have to call that, and in that you have to pass that configuration, and let's call it config, and we are importing the configuration from this file, amplify configuration.json. Right, and whatever configuration we are getting, let's just pass that. So we have successfully configured this Amplify core library from our front-end project to talk to the services. Now to use the UI components, we have to import couple of CSS files, right? Let me do that. So import. So this is I'm just importing a couple of CSS file from this path. So basically AWS Amplify UI React, that library we have installed, and from there I'm just importing style.css, and that will basically give you all the CSS that is necessary for the UI components, and I will be showing you in a moment what do I mean by that. So let me close everything, and in the app.jsx, this is our main component. Okay, and we are having header and all the body and everything. Now let me run this application, npm run dev. If I go here, I can see the application. Okay, now there's a higher order component called with authenticator. Okay, that is coming from AWS Amplify UI React. Okay, if I take this higher order component and wrap our app component like this, then this higher order component will pick up that authentication that we have initialized in our backend, right? And our app will be behind that authentication all. So now if I give it a save, and if everything is correct, then yeah, we should have an authentication layer. And this is all customizable. If you visit the documentation, go to the authentication part, you can customize everything from here, from flow to the UI component and everything. Okay, but for this video, I'm not showing you whatever default, that is fine for us. And now you will be able to create new account. So let me enter my email address and the password. I'm just choosing password 123, same for this. And if I hit create account, actually it will send you a confirmation code in your email address. So that will be handled by AWS, but you can add your own domain if you want. Those are some advanced stuff, but for our case, that is fine. Like whatever AWS is doing, that's fine. So hit create account, and it has sent a confirmation code. You can see like everything is handled for us properly. Okay, we got our verification code. Let me enter that, hit confirm, and now we can log in properly. Okay, if I hit refresh, you can see the login information is stored in our local storage, browser's local storage. And yeah, And now we just have to implement this logout functionality. So when you are wrapping your application with this with authenticator higher order component, it will actually pass two props to your application. Now to get all this information, you just have to go to this authentication, setup Amplify auth, and you will get all the code from here, right? So you can see, like, if you are wrapping this app component with authenticator higher order component, you will get these two. So let me copy that. Let me pass here sign out function and the user. And if I go to the header component, you can see we are expecting that. We are expecting the email and the logout function. So let me pass that. So logout function will be equal to that sign out that we are getting from the higher order component. And the email is coming from, so if you console log this user, let us console log this user. Let's see like what is coming in this user. So I'm just console logging. Let's not pass anything yet. Let's give it a save. This is our development server. And you can see we're getting an object. Inside the object, there's some user ID, username, and there's a sign in details. And inside that, there's a login ID, and login ID is containing your email address. So you want that. So email will be user.signindetails.login ID. Is it? Yeah, login ID. Perfect. If I give it a save, now we're getting this. Okay. And if I hit logout, I'm logged out. In the fourth step, we are going to be adding a simple GraphQL API. To follow this, you don't have to be a master at GraphQL. We'll be creating a very simple schema, and whatever we are doing, it will make sense. To create an API, you have to run Amplify Add API. And for our case, we'll be choosing GraphQL. So basically, it will give you an schema. If you are familiar with Prisma, it will almost similar to that. So on that schema file, you will be having some model, and based on that model, it will set up all the DynamoDB database and all the storage unit and everything. Okay, so let us choose GraphQL. It will make sense, and whatever default is there, that is fine for us for now. And now it has created a local schema. So let us edit that schema. So this is the schema, and this is open to public. Okay, so for now, we are not adding any authorization rule, but if you want, you can visit the documentation and you can learn for yourself how to add authentication to your GraphQL endpoint. So we'll be having a model called project, okay, that will have an ID. So if we do not put this sign, then the value will be optional. So this is simple GraphQL schema. If you are familiar with GraphQL, then like this should make sense to you. Then the second attribute should be user ID, and that will be an ID as well. And we will be adding a custom directive called index. So basically we want to retrieve all the project by this user ID. And you can find these custom directives from the documentation, Amplify documentation as well. But for now, let me just show you. So I'm calling this index by user, and we want to generate some front-end code. And in the front-end code, we will be having a query field called project by user. With this, we'll be retrieving all the project by the user. And the project will have a name, a description, and some colors, and it will be a string array. Right? Let me give it a save. And Prettier is not happy. What's the problem here? I guess I have to use double quote. Yeah, now everything is fine. So we have created a model called project, and these are the attributes that will be present inside that model. We are happy with this. Now let me open the terminal again. Amplify push API. This will push all the local changes to the cloud. Yes. And now it is asking you, do you want to create any local code for your generated GraphQL API? So if you are familiar with GraphQL code gen, so this is a feature of that. So Amplify is just using that library to generate front-end code from your GraphQL schema, and we want that. So let's generate code for our JavaScript. Whatever default is there, that is fine. And now it will deploy everything to the cloud, and it will generate the code here as well. And by the way, it has created this API folder. Previously, we had this auth folder. Now you can see there is an API folder, and inside that we are having this schema file, right? If you want to change anything, you just change in the schema and you run this command again, amplify push, and it will update everything. All right, so it has successfully generated our API, and this is the GraphQL endpoint and the API key. So if I show you all the files now in the source directory inside this Amplify configuration, we are having all those endpoint and API key, and we have configured our Amplify. Let me close the schema quickly. We have configured our Amplify library with all those configuration, so we can now just generate a client and call that GraphQL endpoint. Okay, so to do that, let me go back to the documentation, and if I select Amplify GraphQL, set up GraphQL API. So this part is done, this Amplify add API, and we have added our model. Now we have to generate a client. So we have completed the configuration part. Now we have to generate this client. So let me do one thing. Let me copy the whole thing and create a new file inside my lib directory called API client.js. Okay, let me paste it here. Now we don't need Amplify, we don't need the configuration, we have done that, and we are just bringing this generate client, and we are generating a client, and we are exporting this from this file. Okay, let me close that, and now we just have to replace our mock data in this API project with the real data. So let me delete this mock data first. Perfect. Now the first thing we need is the email or the user ID for that user we want to list the project, right? So to do that, there are two options. So in the app, if you remember correctly, when we are calling this higher order component, it is passing this user object and the sign out method, right? So we need this user object. Now option number one can be we can pass this user object to this list project method, right? But instead of doing that, there is a separate helper function from Amplify that is called get current user, right? We'll be using this function, and this is returning a promise. So let me await that, and this get current user will return you this user, and from this user object we need this sign in details and login ID. Okay, so let me copy that, let me put it inside a bracket, and we are getting the email address from here. Okay, so we have the email address now. Let me bring the client from the lib API, and there's a method called GraphQL. We'll be calling that, and we have to pass the query. Now inside this source directory, you can see it has created a new GraphQL directory, this one, right? And we have all our mutations, queries, and subscription. So these are auto generated for you based on your schema, right? So we'll be using these queries and mutations. So let me bring all the queries from GraphQL queries. Perfect. And in the query, we want to pass queries dot project by user, right? And if I command click here, it will take me to that project by user query. So you can see we have to pass a variable called user ID, and that is mandatory. So let me go back to my project, and in the variable section, we have to pass this user ID. Perfect. And user ID will be equal to this email, and we have to await this. And whatever data is coming, we'll be just returning that. So that will be inside response. Response will contain this data, and inside the data, the structure is, if you want, you can console log this and check the structure by yourself. But whatever name you are having, your query name or mutation name, inside the data, there will be an object called that name. Okay, so like this, project by user. And if that is an array, then it will be having an items array, right? So inside the items array, you will be having all of your projects, right? So I'm just returning that. Let me give it a save, and let us run our development server. So pnpm run dev. Perfect. Let me go back to my application. So you can see right now we don't have any project. All right. If I open the dev tools, and in the network tab, let me give it a refresh. We should have a GraphQL query. So this is that GraphQL query. You can see we're getting a 200, and inside the payload, we are sending these variables, and it is sending us some data. Inside the data, that project by user, and we are having this items array. Right? So that's working fine. And now let us set up this mutation. So for the mutation as well, we need this email. Let me copy this line, and again, response is equal to await client.graphql query. By the way, if you are using TypeScript with this setup, then it will be super helpful. But for demonstration purposes, I'm just using JavaScript. Yeah, now let me bring all the mutations. So mutations from mutations. Perfect. That will be mutations dot create project, and the variables, let me come and click on this create project, and you can see we have to pass all this create project input. Okay, So there will be an input top level key, and inside that we have to pass an object. So let me show you what do I mean by that. So inside the variable there will be an input, and inside that input we'll be having, you don't have to pass the ID. If you do not pass any ID, then ID will be auto generated, but you have to pass the user ID. And you can get this name from here. So if I go backend API schema, so we have to pass the user ID because that is mandatory, name that is mandatory, description and colors are optional. So let me copy this whole thing, let me paste it here. So user ID will be equal to this email, name will be equal to whatever name that is coming, right? Description, same thing, whatever that is coming in the function. And right now we are sending a single color, so we can pass the colors like this. Okay, let me give it a save, and let me return the response from here as well, response.data. And this time it is not an array, so it will be just under this create project. So yeah, our development server is running. Let me go back. So let's call it test description, and let me choose a color, hit add. So it has added a color. So if I refresh now, you can see I'm getting that. So now let us work on this update thing. So we need to add some colors. So to do that, we have to set up this update. Let me just copy paste some code. I don't want to bore you with repetitive code. So for the update, we are bringing this update project mutation, and in the variables we are passing the ID for the project and all the attributes that we want to update. Okay, if I give it a save, let's go back. Now we'll be able to add a color. So let me come up with a color ID, hit add. You can see it has added a color. If I hit refresh, you can see the data is persisted. So we have got our application ready in the local system. Now we want to add hosting. To host the application, you have to run Amplify add hosting. Now we'll be choosing the first one, hosting with Amplify console. And if we want, we can add a Git-based deployment. Means whenever you are pushing the code to a certain branch, that will deploy everything. But for now, let us go with manual deployment. This is easy as well. Okay, so we have successfully added the hosting. Now if I just type Amplify publish, this should build all of our front-end code and publish everything into an S3 bucket, and it will add a distribution CDN in front of that as well. So yeah, it will be a production ready application. So run Amplify publish. During the initialization, that Amplify init, if you remember correctly, it took that build command for your project. So it will be using those build command to build your application, and it will use that dist directory to get the artifacts. So yeah, are you sure you want to continue? So it is giving you all these things. So Amplify hosting, it will be creating, and the authentication and the API, these two services, there is no change. Okay, so hit yes. Alright, so deployment is done. You can see it has created a URL. If you have a particular domain, then from the AWS console, you can add the domain. But for testing purposes, this is fine. So let me copy it. And if I go back to my browser and paste this URL, you can see I'm having this application, and I'll be able to log in, hit sign in. And these are the project we have added previously. Now this is a publicly hosted app, and you can share the URL with anyone. Finally, I want to show you how you can delete the whole project from the cloud. To delete the whole project, you run Amplify delete, and it will delete all the things from this Amplify directory. Hit Y. Alright, so the project has been deleted, and it has deleted the project from the cloud as well as it has deleted from the local directory. So that's all about building a full stack application on AWS. If you're serious about AWS and want to take your career to the next level, make sure you're checking out our courses on courses.learnwithshobhan.com. Link in the description. That's all for this video. If you have any further question, please let me know. I will see you in the next one. Thanks.